Good afternoon. My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm a professor of political science and the director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to today's conversation on Europe, in which we will be discussing democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe with a focus on Poland and Hungary. Our next conversation will be on January 21st and will be a discussion on the ever-evolving question of Brexit following the UK elections. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center and the University Center of International Studies at Pitt. Our co-sponsors are the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Florida International University, the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida, and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Georgia Tech. Thank you to my colleague Iris Matijevic for her help in organizing today's event. So to get us started, following the fall of the Iron Curtain and the breakup of the Soviet Union, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe transitioned to liberal democratic states, opening up their economies, their societies, and political systems. By the late 1990s, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic have joined NATO, and several other Central and East European countries joined shortly thereafter. By 2004, 8 former communist countries joined the European Union in the largest expansion of the organization to date, increasing the number of member states to 25. 2 others would join in the next 4 years. Within a few years, however, many of these countries began to reverse course, electing leaders who were more interested in promoting their own ideas of patriotism, nationalism, and consolidation of power at the expense of further or even sustained democratization. How did this happen, and who or what is to blame? And what are the differences across the region? Today we are joined by 4 experts to discuss this trend of democratic backsliding that we are witnessing in many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and to help us further understand what is going on. I am joined currently by three colleagues, and we'll be joined in a bit by a 4th. First is my colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, Isa Ding, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here at Pitt, and is joining us today from China. She's a scholar of comparative political development with a focus on East Asia and Eastern Europe. Her work focuses on environmental politics and policy and the politics of authoritarianism and democracy. Her book, The Performative State, Public Opinion, Public Pageantry, and Environmental Governance in China, is currently under review at Cornell University Press. For the 2019-2020 academic year, she is a visiting associate at the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. Next, we're joined by Grzymala-Busse, who is the Michelle and Kevin Douglas Professor of International Studies in the Department of Political Science and Senior Fellow at the Freeman Savagli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Her research focuses on political parties, state development and transformation, informal political institutions, religion and politics, and post-communist politics. Her first 2 books examined communist successor parties in East Central Europe and the role of parties in rebuilding the post-communist state. Her most recent book, Nations Under God, published by Princeton University Press, examines why some churches have been able to yield enormous policy influence, while others have not. We are also joined by Zsolt Enyedi, who is professor and co-rector for Hungarian Affairs Hungarian Affairs in the Doctoral School of Political Science, Public Policy, and International Relations at the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. His research focuses on party politics, comparative government, church and state relations, and political psychology, especially authoritarianism, prejudices, and political tolerance. He has published widely on these topics, including recent publications on democratic backsliding and academic freedom in Hungary, Orban's illiberalism, populist parties, and the role of party politics in de-democratization. So welcome to all 3 of you. We have a lot to talk about, and so let's get started. So as I prefaced in the introduction, countries such as Poland and Hungary made great strides in democratic reforms in the 1990s and early 2000s. But we know that a lot has happened since then. And so I thought we could kind of do a round of the 3 of you to talk a bit about what's happened, how we got where we are, and how we got where we are today. So Anna, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So we do see quite a bit of democratic backsliding in the region. Perhaps the most notorious of these cases is Hungary, where since 2010, the Fidesz government has been systematically dismantling both the formal institutions of democracy and rule of law, such as court independence, media autonomy, university autonomy, and so on, and has also been undermining the informal institutions of democracy, such as conflict of interest laws, limits on the kind of self-serving that goes on within government, and so on. To a lesser extent, we observe the same pattern in Poland since 2015, and in Czechia since basically 2017 or so. But this is, I think, more symptomatic of a sort of broader backsliding in the region, where at various points democratic accomplishments are undermined. And I think what's the sort of underlying cause here really is that these countries are becoming the victims of their own success. In that, to get to the EU, to get to NATO, to get to all these liberal democratic and economic reforms in the first place, they had to generate an enormous amount of elite consensus among the main political players. And in so doing, they basically ignored any kind of criticism or any kind of sort of notes of caution that or reservations that society may have had. And the result was basically, after these mainstream options were tried out, the only critics of this consensus were the sort of populist, extremist, anti-democratic parties. And they're the ones who basically then come to power, and they're the ones who basically start to dismantle democracy. And I here like to also point out that it's not necessarily the case that these are somehow, the radical right parties that we see in Western Europe. These are, in fact, parties that are much more moderate in their stances, but whose populist, illiberal commitments are nonetheless very powerful.
Great, thank you. Zsolt, do you want to follow up on that?
Yes, I agree with everything Anna said. What I would like to add is that post-communist countries constitute a very mixed bag. If you look at the various rankings of quality of democracy across the world, you will see that some of them rank Slovenia higher than Portugal, and they rank Estonia above France. So some of the post-communist countries do extremely well, also economically, by the way, but also in terms of democratic quality. But it's true that particularly the Central Eastern European countries that are sometimes called the Visegrad countries, have undergone an incredible decline. There was a decline across the world since 2005, by the way, according to Freedom House. But this region has declined particularly sharply, with Hungary being in the lead and followed indeed by Poland. Now, what we need to remember, though, that maybe some of the high evaluations that these countries received 10 or 15 years ago were a bit premature. It's a little bit dangerous to decide about a country whether it is a consolidated democracy or not only after a couple of years. And perhaps when we thought at the end of the 20th century that the region already reached a minimum level of liberal democracy, then we have overestimated the role of formal institutions, and we haven't paid enough attention to the underlying norms.
Isa, would you like to add any comment?
Yeah, so based on the really interesting point that Zsolt just raised, I wanted to raise 2 points for discussion, which is what I find particularly interesting about the region. So one is on comparison. So it was just mentioned that there is a wide variation in terms of the degree of democratic backsliding in Europe, but also within the Visegrad 4. I find it very interesting that it seems that Poland and Hungary have backslid far more than Czech Republic and Slovakia. And I think it will be really interesting to think about what explains this, or if there is a variation, if so, what explains this. And my own work looks at the more lingerie explanations in terms of the nation's imperial past and so forth. But I would like to just raise this variation, see if we can think about what are some of the possible causes. And the other thing is, so in the note that JJ you sent us, I saw that you raised the question of who should we blame, the institutions, parties, and so forth. And I also want to raise the question, which is not my own opinion, but to what extent should we blame the voters? Because it seems that So it seems that in Poland and Hungary, I'm sure there's a lot of backsliding of liberalism, a backsliding of liberal democracy. It seems that the electoral connection between politicians and voters stay very strong, which is the core of democracy, if not liberal democracy. So I do wonder to what extent should we think about different aspects of democracy, the institutional aspects, and then the policy aspects in terms of liberalism and so forth.
But I wonder if we could, because we tease out this term a little bit more. We use this term of democratic backsliding quite a lot, and the media has been using it quite a lot lately. There's obviously been a lot of discussion, and I wonder if we can kind of tease out this term of what we mean by sort of backsliding. I think all of you point to make the interesting point, of course, that there is a lot of variation, and we aren't seeing necessarily the same types of things mirrored across the Visegrad countries, for example, but to kind of tease out kind of some, sort of examples of what we've been talking a lot about this term. So whoever would like to sort of start kind of giving us a little bit more that. Anna, I will call on you.
Yes, Professor Stu. So I mean, it's not clear to me that this is a definition that everyone would agree with, but to me, it seems that democratic backsliding consists of perhaps three distinct aspects. The first of this is sort of the undermining of the formal institutions of democracy. And so going after independent institutions of monitoring and oversight, of checks on power. And here we're talking about courts, we're talking about the media, we're talking about civil society. And it's basically, I think that's some of the first step. So it's in the undermining of these, it's the politicization of state administration and of the state economic connections and so on. I think the second aspect of it is also the undermining of informal democratic values. And here, for example, dismissing the opposition as traitorous, dismissing media criticism as fake news, not treating the institutions of democracy seriously. Babiš, for example, the prime minister of Czechia, was notorious for dismissing the parliament as a talking shop. So it's both this sort of formal erosion and informal questioning of these institutions. And I think there's the third aspect that we see, especially in Hungary and in Poland, which is the rewriting of national history in ways that favors the governing political party and its views of society. And so we see, for example, in Poland, this heroic rewriting of history, the entire post-'89 period as being dismissed as somehow tainted by various compromises. In Hungary, there's the equation of Nazism with communism in the House of Terror Museum, and so on. And I think, there are these three elements of formal erosion, informal undermining, and kind of a rewriting of history to favor the incumbents.
I think that's really helpful, Zsolt.
If I may connect Isa's and Anna's point, I think that the attack against the liberal element of liberal democracy is overwhelmingly obvious.
Yes.
That is the rule of law, checks and balances, state neutrality, and so on. The democratic element is a little bit less obviously broken in the sense that, as Isa mentioned, there is some sort of connection between elected rulers and masses in terms of certain policy preferences. At the same time, given that in some of these countries there is no level playing field, we cannot know for sure what is the real social support behind the governing parties. In some special circumstances, we can gauge the amount. For example, in case of last election in Hungary, we looked at the voting patterns of those who live outside of Hungary, thinking that perhaps they are less under the influence of this very biased media environment. And what we found that indeed they support much less the ruling party, but still the support is above 40%. So as opposed to 52, it was 40. So there is actual bottom-up support for some of these authoritarian tendencies. and therefore the regimes are more stable than many of the Middle Eastern or I don't know, Latin American regimes that are more supported only by elite factors or international factors.
Do you want to offer your thoughts on this?
Sure. Oh, me or?
Lisa, go ahead.
Okay. So in terms of the definition for democratic backsliding, I think it's really interesting because if I were to define the term, I would say that the erosion of formal institutions and perhaps even informal institutions that are necessary to sustain a democracy. But then I think if we were to look at the phenomenon of democratic backsliding, then I think it's primarily in terms of the erosion of liberalism in these societies. But then if we were to think about the causes of democratic backsliding or the causes of the phenomenon of democratic backsliding in these societies, then I very much kind of agree with Anna that nationalism seems to be perhaps a pretty proximate cause, in my opinion. It seems clear that the expression of right-wing populism or authoritarianism, if you will, in these societies have a very strong nationalist tone to it.
So I think we've kind of been talking a bit about the sort of how we've sort of gotten to this point, but I wonder if there is any point at which we can kind of point to, I guess, to say when we really started to see the trends that you've all just really, I think, very nicely sort of described in terms of erosion of formal institutions, informal democratic values, rewriting of history, all of these kinds of things. Sort of, can we point to specific events that may have happened, an election, et cetera, for example, or international events, right? Things like that we can really point to kind of where we started to see this kind of sliding away from liberalism towards sort of these illiberal, what we might call illiberal regimes, or perhaps obviously non-democratic regimes. Whoever wants to jump in, Zsolt.
So the two most prominent international events that come to my mind are the 2008 financial crisis and the election of Trump. These events strengthened the self-confidence of authoritarians in the region and weakened the confidence in a liberal democratic European project. Beyond these events, there is, of course, a kind of evolutionary change in attitudes, and this change can be dated back to accession. Prior to accession, these countries understood that they do have to emulate or accommodate to the Western norms, and there was a pretty wide consensus. But this consensus eroded, and political entrepreneurs realized after accession that there is no reason to keep to these norms, because actually the European Union is not powerful enough to compel these countries to follow these norms. And once internationally, with the rise of China and the re-strengthening of Russia, the landscape has changed. A number of politicians in Eastern Europe realized that there is no unipolar world anymore, that the Western, Northern American liberal consensus is not the only one that can be followed.
Yeah, so I agree with Zsolt absolutely about this eroding consensus, and it's not even clear that Trump was the one who precipitated it. That consensus basically had been eroding for quite some time. I think parties like Fidesz had already made the transition towards a much more conservative authoritarian formation by the early 2000s. PiS, when it was in power in 2005, 2007, was already doing a lot of the same stuff that it's doing right now. I think the big difference comes when these parties basically achieve unalloyed political power. So in Hungary, in 2010, Fidesz gets 2/3 of the seats, which means that it has a parliamentary supermajority to change the constitution. In 2015, PiS for the first time can govern without a coalition partner who would act as a brake or a constraint on its sort of project. And so I think that's sort of, the immediate cause. I'm more skeptical about the economic crisis, only because we see cases where there was an economic crisis, but no sort of populist response or sort of extremist response, right? Places like Portugal or Ireland, on the one hand. On the other hand, we see places like Finland or Poland, which didn't suffer economically at all, and yet exhibit these sort of strong sort of, anti-democratic support for anti-democratic parties. So I think there might be a connection there on a more global level, but I don't think it necessarily predicts the success of any of these parties.
Yeah, in terms of events, I was going to say the exact same two events, but then I found Anna's gentle rebuttal very, very helpful. And I think, to kind of think about this more broadly, and I think there is definitely contagion, authoritarian contagion or illiberal contagion. It seems like somehow, and maybe not, maybe not Trump election first, but I think there is. It seems the populist leaders are in one way or another intersubjective, or the voters perhaps seem to be inspired by events that take place elsewhere. But then obviously we need to kind of think about why it did not take place in certain places. And I think that's really, really important point. Perhaps we can discuss later, because I think we pay a lot of attention to democratic backsliding that takes place in around the world, because those are events. Those are always in the news, and we're always paying attention to that. But perhaps it's helpful to study what are some of the candidate cases where it did not take place, even despite recession and so forth. And then the other point related to economy, and I think perhaps emigration, not immigration, but emigration of skilled laborers from these countries might serve as some kind of long-term drain of support for liberalism in these countries.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it's always interesting to think about why something didn't happen somewhere. And I think that's, as we think kind of more about this, to think about why obviously there were instances of where we don't see democratic backsliding, or we may see some of the, the kinds of things that might kind of line up, right? And I think the point about kind of that economic recession I think is part of the mix. In the East European context, but obviously we have examples where we aren't seeing that, and sort of why, and I think Ireland and Portugal are obviously examples that come to mind immediately as well, where we had those countries suffering quite a bit economically as well, and why we didn't see, especially I suppose in the case of Portugal. And I think just to kind of follow up on Isa's point about emigration, I think that, when we think about, right, the movement of people within Europe, right, and the freedom of movement, and the fact that those who are often left are those that are perhaps the most supportive of the illiberal regimes, and those that are leaving are the least supportive. And so how that then, and as those patterns change, and those are obviously related to the economic piece as well, and so all of these things kind of coming together, I think, as I've read recently, the term perfect storm keeps being kind of coming up. So I think that something that we're seeing. I want to turn to something to the specific question of academic freedom. And Zsolt, I know, you are especially positioned, I think, to talk about this. I know you've written on this, and just from your own experience of being in Hungary. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about kind of the relationship between some of this, these turn towards liberalism and academic freedom, and sort of how those two are connected, and the kinds of things that we're seeing, especially in Hungary.
Indeed, I have some personal account here. I commute now between Vienna and Budapest because of the problems with academic freedom in Hungary. And probably my whole life will change in the coming years because of that. But the issue is not only CEU, my university, but in general, the freedom of academia in Hungary. To a lesser extent, probably there is a similar issue in Poland as well, and one can hear about minor incidents in other countries as well. I think in those regimes, is academic freedom more in danger where the leaders ascribe to some sort of quasi-fundamentalist ideology, and they consider intellectuals potential challengers even if they are not active politically, but simply by supporting different worldviews and obviously trying to hold the leaders accountable by looking at issues such as corruption, rule of law, and so on. Originally, Fidesz government was not particularly interested in universities, in research institutes. Probably it did not even hope at the beginning that it will have the power to impose its own narrative on every single institution. But after being elected with 2/3 majority for the second time and then for the third time, and coming back a little bit to Trump, being emboldened by changes in the United States and elsewhere in the world, they thought, why not? Why not to challenge the liberal worldview from the bottom up across all institutions. They put a lot of money into new institutions as well, particularly religious institutions or church-related institutions that have a very, very conservative view. But they don't have enough intellectuals to fill all these positions, so they also pay a lot of attention at undermining or even destroying alternative institutional networks, particularly those that are supported by foreign sources, not only in academia, but also in the NGO world, in civil society. And this is one of the interesting new turns of the ideology in the region, that civil society that was kind of worshipped even by right-wingers in the previous decade now became almost a synonym of conspiracies. So the idea is that NGOs work on behalf of some foreign power that wants to undermine national sovereignty, and they also use universities and other institutions of soft power to basically attack the leaders who are elected by the people and who have a legitimacy directly from the people. So this kind of dichotomy between elected leaders and non-elected people, including NGO activists, professors, judges, is something that is quite relevant today in the region.
Thank you. Now I can imagine that, from where you're sitting, you're sort of watching you're personally experiencing this and sort of watching all of this. And so I wonder if you could just for those that may not be familiar, kind of give a little bit of the situation now with the CEU being obviously largely in Vienna, and your comment to sort of commuting back and forth. I wonder if you could just provide a little bit more information on that.
So more than 2 years ago, the Hungarian parliament adopted a new law on higher education that demands from foreign universities, primarily non-European universities like CEU, we are an American university in terms of our headquarter and legal personality and accreditation, demanding many new conditions, one of them having a campus in the United States, or teaching in the United States, the other one having an international agreement between the Hungarian government and the country of origin. In our case, that's the state of New York. And although we have provided most of these conditions in one way or another, the documents that we have submitted were not even examined by the authorities. We are waiting for the government to look at the evidence that we collected and to tell us whether we are legal or not for almost 2 years by now. And the Hungarian government representatives tell in media that CEU has failed to meet these new preconditions, but the license of the university was not withdrawn. So on paper, we could exist and teach here, but because any day our license can be withdrawn, we had no choice but to establish a new campus in Vienna. And although this year is a transitory year, so we have many courses here, many courses there, but from the next September on, more than 90% of the courses have to be in Vienna.
Thank you. I'm sure that's obviously been quite a challenge there. I want to turn now. We are before that. Hi, Milada.
Hello.
We are now joined by our fourth panelist. Actually, that was very good timing. So, welcome. Milada Vachudova, who has just joined us, is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at UNC Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on the democratization of post-communist Europe, the enlargement of the EU, and the impact of international actors on domestic politics. She's published widely on populism, democratization, and democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe, including her book, Europe Undivided, Democracy, Leverage, and Integration After Communism, published by Oxford. So Milada, we've just been kind of taking a bit of the tour of the region in our discussion. And so I wonder if you could kind of give some perspectives on the Czech Republic in terms of the situation in terms of democratic backsliding, your thoughts on kind of how we got there to get us going. So.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. It's great to be here. The Czech Republic is sort of a fascinating case because it's a country that no one really expected to go down this road because it doesn't have a tradition of sort of grandiose nationalism like maybe Hungary and Poland. And it's a country that has done economically very well, I would say, in the last 30 years. And it's a country that, in terms of attitudes, Czechs have a reputation of being sort of tolerant and civic-minded. Well, alas, what we have found out is that, in the current parliament, you have 60% of Czech voters voting for parties that I would argue are far-right, anti-immigrant, or at least kind of ethno-populist. And I think what happened is that in the Czech Republic, you had in the birth of this party called ANO, which was founded by a very, very wealthy oligarch. And what was so interesting about Babiš is that Andrej Babiš, the Prime Minister of Czech Republic, he's probably the most corrupt person in the Czech Republic, but he came to power in those first elections in 2013 on an anti-corruption platform. So in a way, he's a genius, right? And, his message originally was kind of a technocratic message. Let's run the country like a firm. Let's, make it more efficient and less corrupt. But he's pivoted towards, being part of the club with the peace in Poland and with Orban in Hungary, in that he, on the one hand, attacks majoritarian institutions, attacks the rule of law, and tries to dismantle, although he hasn't so far succeeded in an institutional way. He controls a huge swath of the media, and on the other hand, has used these ethno-populist appeals to get elected. And most of that has been aimed towards refugees from the Middle East, which are not existent in the Czech Republic. So you have the irony of a whole campaign being fought against, Muslim refugees coming from the Middle East. There are actually none there. So that, it's kind of revealed a real kind of racist part of the electorate. Now, the other good thing about the interesting thing about the Czech Republic is that there is now a real counter-mobilization to Babiš. And we saw 300,000 people protesting again 2 weekends ago. There were similarly large protests last June. And these protests are fascinating because when you listen to them, they're against Babiš, but they're also very much like a full-throated defense of liberal democracy. Sort of like if I asked my graduate students to write an essay about what is liberal democracy and why should we defend it. This is what the tenor of that is. So that's hopeful. My concern, though, is that it's too far removed from party politics.
Thank you. So I want to, something that's kind of come up several times in various comments is the question of, who to blame for what we're seeing. And so I want to kind of get all your different perspectives, and there's a lot to cover when we talk about this. We can think about, obviously, and we've heard a lot, of course, about specific individuals and parties, voters obviously voting in these parties, institutions, including the European Union, as perhaps where we might point to kind of some of the of what's going on. So I wonder, Anna, if you want to jump in on this, and whatever, there's a lot there, so go wherever you'd like to with that.
So I think there's a proximate cause and a distal cause, right? And the distal cause, the more distant one, is really sort of the pressure for these countries to institute a raft of reforms after 1989. It is sort of, the kinds of pressures that the EU put on them to sort of basically make all kinds of concessions in the run-up to EU accession in 2004. And so there's basically a homogenization of politics, where even though parties still, continue to try to play their role, they're basically perceived as increasingly part of the same swamp by the voters. And people like Grigor Papelkesh have shown this, that basically voters choose one mainstream party after another and don't perceive much difference. Margit Tabitz and Natalia Letki have shown that both left and right-wing parties implement the same raft of liberal economic reforms. They don't differ on economic policy. So for better or worse, I think this is where we get to the proximate cause. I think political parties are to blame, largely because they're perceived as not really offering much of an alternative to the voters. They're no longer competing really on the economy. They're not really competing on policy. A lot of times these days they're competing basically either on outdoing each other, as Milada has shown, outdoing each other in appeals to basically ethno-nationalism, or they're sort of competing on valence issues, who can basically better constrain immigration and things like that. And so voters basically perceive they have no choice. Parties aren't accountable. Parties aren't responsive. Parties don't offer sort of, a series of distinct policies. And what winds up happening is that in that situation, populist parties, as the only critics of EU accession and of liberal reforms, as the only parties that speak some more of a sort of popular or even vulgar language, become much more appealing. So I think there are sort of bigger forces at work here, as Zsolt has mentioned. But I think the sort of proximate cause is the convergence of political parties, and in the eyes of the electorate, at least, their indistinguishability.
Thank you. Isa, what's your take?
I very much agree with Anna. I think if I were to pick something to blame, that would be the inability of political parties to not adapt to whichever way opinion is swinging. And I think actually, let me step back. It's a little late. I think it's I think the party is to blame, and I think I very much like the message that's in How Democracies Die, that the parties should not just think about getting elected and so forth, and also be perhaps a little more receptive to the voters' voices, but also do a better job at not just focusing on competing against each other. And I think, the point of democracy is to use the institutions to constrain the extremes in opinion. So I think that voters should never to be blamed, and I think institutions should always try to adapt in order to accommodate or in order to better transmit public opinion into public policy. So,
thank you. Zsolt, what's your take on this?
My explanation would run a little bit counter to Anna's, in the sense that as opposed to seeing parties converging too much, I see one of the big issues is polarization. And polarization that has historical roots, particularly in Hungary, and I would not stop with 1989, but I would go more further back in history to 1918, and the type of polarization between liberals and nationalists that developed at least in Hungary after the end of the First World War, that continued in a latent fashion throughout communism, and already in 1989 you could see two distinct camps fighting against each other, not with the communists, but within the anti-communist opposition with each other. And this opposition has always been cultural. So on that point, I think Anna is perfectly right. But whether this is something that we can blame on parties, I'm not sure, because those politicians who try to campaign on economic issues typically received less support than those that emphasized cultural issues. So that I would a little bit go back to blaming the people. I think one of the great things about being a political scientist is that, as opposed to politician, you can blame the people. And I see that there was not enough demand, at least in my country, for a kind of party competition that would have been based mainly on economic issues, pitting, let's say, social democrats against conservatives or Christian democrats. But there has been always more interest on the active citizen side in issues that have something to do with cultural identity, have something to do with national sovereignty, with religious rhetoric, and so on. And Orban, who tried back in the 1990s to sell his product as a kind of neoliberal, pro-European politician, shifted to culturalist, populist options, partly because he realized that there is a much bigger market for product. And he also realized that across the whole Europe and Northern America, there's a discrepancy between the political elites that speak in terms of political correctness norms and ordinary citizens who often would like to hear much less politically correct rhetoric when it comes to cultural issues. So it was to some extent simply responding to demand.
Milada.
I'll make about 3 points. I think the first point, in terms of the long-term versus the short-term causes that Anna mentioned, I think that's really, really an important point, that some of these changes have been going on for decades. And one of them is sort of the ascent of neoliberal economic reforms. So we had, going back to Thatcher and Reagan, this kind of neoliberal orthodoxy, deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, to sum it up. And the Democratic Party in the US and the Labour Party in the UK bought into that orthodoxy. So here, as Anna said, the difference between mainstream parties kind of disappeared because everyone was embracing this kind of neoliberal orthodoxy, which was then recommended and sold to the post-communist states. Now, saying that, it's important to remember there's huge variation, and some of the post-communist states, including the Czech Republic and Hungary, remain among the least unequal in the Western world. And so we can't just point to rising income inequality. We can, for example, in the US and the UK, I think rising income inequality is a real driver. But in post-communist Europe, there is, for example, in Poland, rising inequality, but there's also this perception of being left behind. The irony, though, is that when you vote for these kind of ethno-populists, you often just get more neoliberal economic reform. Now, in Poland and Hungary, they've been very wise in kind of having this robust family policy and making essentially a more statist turn. And Orban will literally say, I'm moving away from this kind of Western liberalism, and that's why I'm providing money for families and so forth. But this kind of family policy that Poland and Hungary have is also very, in the sense that it's very much about, supporting the right Polish families. It isn't about, a broad program to combat poverty. Now, the irony, though, in the UK and the US, right, you just get more neoliberal. There's a more deregulation, more tax breaks. So that's, I think, the tragedy of Trump and Johnson for the people who voted or will vote for them. One of the things which I find really, so the two things that I think are really important. One, academics shouldn't do what Orban and Peace and Babiš do so often, and that is conflate neoliberal economic reform with liberal democracy. So a lot of these populists want to sort of say, hey, neoliberalism was bad, it benefited the establishment cabal, it didn't benefit ordinary citizens, so let's throw that out. And oh, by the way, let's throw out liberal democracy with it, because I want to stay in power forever. And so that's the relationship between ethno-populism and democratic backsliding, right? Is they attack quote unquote liberalism, and that then includes things like in Hungary, independent media, and so forth, checks and balances. So we should all keep these things separate. And I think it's important just to say that liberal democracy opened the door to neoliberal reform. But there's huge variation, as I said, across industrialized countries and how that's played out. And the second thing I want to mention is the EU. So, in terms of proximate causes, I agree with Anna in the sense that I think a lot of mainstream parties have kind of lost the vision. They haven't figured out how to really campaign well. And it's the case that polarization is part of the problem. That's why I'm much more hopeful about the Polish opposition, because, when you look at our Chapel Hill expert survey, the Polish opposition parties take positions on the left-right economic spectrum, which are really very, very odd. Whereas Hungary, there's no variation. It's the civilizational, left versus right, culturally speaking, block, liberal versus authoritarian. But some of the proximate causes that also need to be kind of pointed to are, one, the social media environment, which I think has really changed the game and has allowed for tremendous misinformation. I mean, just look at what's happening in the United Kingdom this week. Incredible amounts of just plain lies being perpetrated, and they spread, and they're, it's so easy for these ethno-populists to use these kind of tactics, and what used to end political careers now just barely makes it into the paper. So that's important. They play dirty, and I think it's hard for mainstream or opposition parties to counter that. And the other is the EU. In Poland and Hungary, the EU is actually very popular. No one is talking about leaving the EU anymore. Yet you can easily blame everything on the EU. And this is a long-standing problem, but the ethno-populists have done such a good job of weaponizing the EU, right? Anything that goes wrong, blame it on the EU. Anything that goes right, take credit for it. But they take it kind of to a new level. But that is sort of a fundamental problem of the EU. The EU needs to figure out how to do a better job of communicating to citizens across Europe, what it is and what it does. It needs to do a better job of countering kind of disinformation campaigns in real time, which is actually separate from Anna's point about how, over the course of the last 3 decades, the EU has been part of this kind of consensus on economic policy making, this perception that, there isn't much variation. Yeah, I'll end there. I have a lot to say. Thanks.
Thank you. No, I think this was a really interesting, just sort of listening and sort of jotting down notes, kind of thinking about all of the various things, right? And I think the one thing that was quite apparent across all of your different comments is that it's not one thing, right? So it's not, it's not that we can say, oh, it's this one institution, it's this one individual, right? But it's the existing parties, right? It's party convergence, and obviously we're seeing that in Western Europe as well. We talk about sort of obviously the rise of populist parties as well, and parties not being able to differentiate themselves, voters looking for that. And we're also seeing, as you said, the parties. You have specifics as Zsolt mentioned in terms of cultural polarization. In Hungary, you have elements of the EU, of social media, etc. So I think anyone listening to this who perhaps wasn't really thinking, oh, there's one individual or institution to blame, that it really is a combination of a lot of different things that we're seeing that has led to this point. Something I want to get back to, but I want to take a break for a minute and give a chance for those in the audience, in which we have a large audience here and then also joining us remotely. I know there are questions, and I know individuals have to leave a bit early, so I want to give a chance for some questions. But one thing I just to kind of throw out so that you can all jot that down is to think about how the role of the EU in the sense of tolerating these parties and these individuals, and how that has perhaps perpetuated the backsliding that we're seeing. So I want to get back to that, but before we do, I want to ask for any questions. Ron Linden.
Thanks, Gigi, and I want to thank the panel for their insightful comments, even if they are a bit fixated on political parties. And I want to pick up on what Milada said about the EU, because I think its role has been crucial. I would identify three aspects. One, Zsolt mentioned what I call the feet to the fire aspect. The EU didn't really hold these countries to a standard once they were admitted. They didn't have the political gumption or will to hold them. The second is, I think, often missed. It's not just that the EU failed with regard to its policies towards East Europe, it's that it failed catastrophically on crucial issues: migration, income inequality, how to deal with debtor countries. And so its role as a model, what it did before, this extraordinary achievement from 1889 to 2004, is not so much fake news as old news. It doesn't have any currency anymore. What have you done for me lately? Imagine the counterfactual. Imagine if the EU had come up with an equitable, efficient, effective migration policy as a model of how to disperse the challenges to all the countries. That would be a powerful model. Of course, it's not there, nor is there a powerful model of other things, to wit, and Milada pointed to this, the failure to sort of sell themselves. And third, nobody's mentioned this, but we should consider this, the role of Brexit. Brexit has preoccupied and weakened, as well as taking out of the organization one of its most powerful members, and I think opened the door for opportunities for other political forces. You're right, we shouldn't bash the EU, and it's very common to do so. It's like complaining about migrants when there aren't any. But there are some actual factors that need to be considered.
All right, who would like to...
Well, let me make it a question. That need to be considered?
There you go. Respond to the comment and question. Just who? Isa.
So I'll just jump onto that point and also raise a question, which is if we think about EU's role, and then I know there's plenty going around thinking that EU has not done enough in terms of intervening in the backsliding these countries. But I wonder, when we think about that, to what extent are we underestimating the power of nationalism? And when I go through the thought experiment of more into EU intervention, what comes to my mind is basically more nationalism and more backlash and more.
Isa? Frozen Isa. While we're unfreezing Isa, who would like to?
I would like to jump in.
Milada, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm going to be a little controversial, and I'm going to say, look, I just don't think, Ron, there you are. Hi, Ron. I think the problem is that the EU is being asked to be some kind of a superpower, some kind of a Avengers assemble and deal with all of these different problems all of a sudden, almost all at once. And the reality is that the EU until the early 90s was just an internal market. Anything else it did, it barely did. So it's an economic power, a market power. Its power comes from the internal market. And when it comes to trade negotiations and creating prosperity on the basis of that internal market, the EU is incredible. And the United Kingdom's about to find out how sad it is to be on the outside of that market. But these other things that we want the EU to do, it just wasn't ready to do them. I mean, the EU barely cobbled together the Copenhagen criteria in 1993 about political and economic reforms through an ethnic minority rights, upon which there was no acquis communautaire, no agreement among existing EU members, then kind of outsourced how to deal with ethnic minorities to the OSCE High Commissioner in the Council of Europe. And so post-accession, for example, it's very hard for the EU to enforce kind of standards that barely exist. And that's also true for liberal democracy, right? We all have this conception of what a liberal democracy should have, but EU member states had never really agreed among themselves that they were going to police one another's regimes. And so Berlusconi is a great example, right? Berlusconi did a lot of this stuff. He didn't go as far as Orban, but he did a lot of things to undermine liberal democracy in Italy. The EU didn't do anything. Now, the difference was that Berlusconi didn't proselytize. He didn't go out there and try to change other countries, at least not too much. And he also didn't say he wanted to change the European Union in the way that Orban does. So also with migration policy and the financial crisis, I just think the EU wasn't prepared for those things. The EU doesn't really exist, right? The EU is just a collection of member state governments plus these institutions. If you haven't had the political will to sort of decide amongst yourselves that you're going to be an actor in, say, migration or, regulating banks, when the crisis hits, you're not going to be able to get policy together on the fly when these things have been politicized. I will point, though, to the banking union, which my colleague, Professor Rachel Epstein, works on at University of Denver. She makes a very compelling argument for following the financial crisis. The EU has actually taken pretty substantial steps to integrate further in areas like creating the banking union. And so it's possible that over time, the immigration crisis will also spur more integration in that area, but not right now, right? Not when this issue is so hotly politicized in domestic politics. And maybe it always will, right? Maybe immigration is something the EU will simply never really be able to handle.
So I agree with everything that's been said, but I would add just two things. One is on Brexit. A lot of these problems predate Brexit. I think Brexit is very much a symptom, not a cause. And if you look at the inability of the EU or the member countries to do anything about the democratic backsliding in Hungary, that was well before 2016 and the Brexit vote, right, which took everyone by surprise. So I do think it now, of course, is going to play a role, but Brexit again is a symptom, not a cause. Secondly, not to bring back political parties into this or anything, but part of the reason why the EU hasn't been able to do more about, for example, all that's been going on in Hungary is because of the European People's Party in the EU Parliament, and the fact that Manfred Weber did everything he could to basically veto one sort of attempt after another to examine what was going on in Hungary and to castigate the Fidesz government. Why did he do that? Because Fidesz basically formed a large part of his voting bloc in the European Parliament. So, a lot of this, I think, has to do, as Milada said, less with, what the EU can do and what it's designed to do than it does, again, with the political ambitions of oftentimes rather petty politicians.
Zsolt?
I would like to agree with the point that internal problems of the EU are very consequential in the region. If you think back about the refugee crisis, when EU leaders came up with the idea of the quota, it was followed by kind of embarrassed silence first, and then some populist leaders said, no, we don't think that will work, and we will, even if you vote for it, we will not follow your orders. And then more and more leaders said, and then the EU had to withdraw. It was a very big blow to the EU project, and I think indirectly to the self-confidence of liberal democracy. It's also true that institutions like the European People's Party are extremely much captured by various partial interests, and there is a huge discrepancy between their rhetoric and their behavior. There are many rumors indicating that actually the German car manufacturing industry is a very strong player, and why Manfred Weber behaves in this way, or behaved in the past in this way, or Angela Merkel behaves in this way, has a lot to do with the interest of the German business sector. And while they sort of take these preferences into consideration, they do have a very highbrow, very noble rhetoric about norms and human rights and European values. And then when some of the East European leaders realize that this is a bluff, that you don't have to listen to this because they will actually not follow up on this, then the prestige that was built up during the 1990s, when EU did speak with one voice, and in case of Slovakia, one of the reasons why democratization happened after Mečiar was the EU's the way how EU behaved. That kind of prestige is completely undermined by this huge discrepancy between rhetoric and actions.
To wrap up and to kind of agree with Ron's point, is that it's also difficult to think about how to even quote unquote reform the party institutions in order to solve this problem as well. So.
Thank you. No, I think the question is we've seen kind of throughout these responses is in terms of thinking about the EU, right? That it's the EU can both be to blame, and that on sort of one extreme or sort of on the other, that we have to give the EU some credit as well in terms of where it's been and what it is as an institution, as Milada talked about. But I think the one thing just that I think is important to keep in mind here is that the EU, when we talk about the EU, it's such a varied institution, right? We're talking about everything from sort of the party groups, for example, the EPP, and the support for these parties, or the maybe not the support, but not the opposite of that, I suppose, but also to the institutions themselves in terms of regulation, in terms of how the inner workings of the EU itself is working too. So I think, and that's a very varied spectrum of things as well. I think, is Florida International, are you there, and do you have a question?
It should work. Thank you.
Okay, we can hear you now, so go ahead.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, I missed what Isa said because of our technical issues, but I do have a bit of a pushback for Milada. Yes, no one asked the EU to be a superpower, but they're behaving like one. And I've recently done some research in Hungary and Poland using polling data from the European Union, where yes, there is a high degree of pro-EU sentiment, right? Everybody wants to be a part of the EU, but there is a lot of resentment, specifically when it comes to perceptions of the state's sovereignty. And this existed well before the migrant issue of 2015. And it's only exacerbated by some rhetoric from Emmanuel Macron, who in recent months has referred to the European Union as a state. So that doesn't sit too well with many citizens of the EU, never mind the varying developments and varying positions between member states. So yes, it's a union of membership states, and it was a nice economic club, but the Treaty of Lisbon, which prompted Brexit, kind of sent a different message. Now there's supposed to be so much uniformity. So there's a lot of confusion structurally within the European Union of what it is, and confusion for the citizens of what it is. And it provides the space, to go back to Anna's point about political parties, for them to take advantage of that, right? And to come into power. But so my question is that this democratic backsliding, is it not just a manifestation of just massive confusion out of Brussels of what the European Union actually is, within Brussels and outside of Brussels?
Excellent question. Milada, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. I mean, I would just make 2 points. One about national sovereignty. It's the countries of East Central Europe have been dealt a weak hand when it comes to geopolitics. And so, the history of these countries is being between Moscow and Berlin, also Rome. The history, if you go back the last 100, 200 years, is one of these countries being, or nations being bullied, occupied, etc. The Hungarians and Poles had a better position, but in the interwar years, certainly a very, 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 very weak geopolitical position. So if you think in terms of national sovereignty, I would argue that these countries actually have, in some ways, more national sovereignty inside the European Union because they're protected from bullying from other member states. Look at what's happened to poor Macedonia. I mean, there's no excuse for what Macron has done.
I'm Macedonian, so we can talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. But I would just say that in terms of this, if you think of it as a very powerful club, the European Union, the fact that it offered these East Central European states a place at the table and gave them actually, huge power. The EU amplifies the power of small member states. I think they're actually, in terms of national sovereignty, doing very well. And I would just say that, the kind of what going back to what Zsolt said about kind of blaming the people, there was for so long I argued that really people in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, this distinction needs to drop away. And I still believe that. And I think when we look at democratic backsliding, we see it happening in Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic, but it's also happening in the United Kingdom. It's also happening in the United States. So it's clearly not a post-communist phenomenon. But in terms of popular attitudes, I do think that like far-right and ethno-populist parties have gotten more purchase in these countries. And part of it is just racism. I mean, I know it from my own family, the kinds of things that people, in part, are largely because of the experience of communism and being isolated. But there's also this feeling of, not getting their fair share. So kind of this perception of being the victims. And one of the things which I found most difficult during the refugee crisis was how many voices in East Central Europe were saying, no, we don't want to help the refugees. We're the victims. And, that's a product of the experience of World War II and the way that memory was shaped during the communist years and so on and so forth. But it's also the product of nasty, no-good politicians, right? Like there are political leaders in East Central Europe now who have weaponized these feelings of being left behind and other feeling of, racial resentment. And they've done an incredible job weaponizing them. I mean, the idea that in the Czech Republic you could fight an entire election on, that if we let in 50 refugees, they're going to start blowing up downtown Prague, is really stunning, right? So I think we need to think about like just how, are these guys geniuses? Why have they been able to be so effective? And while there's a lot of variation in the region, the way that the, Babiš and Zeman in the Czech Republic and Orbán in Hungary and Peace in Poland, Salvini in Italy, the way that they appeal to the people is saying, we're representative of the ordinary, true nation, people against these outsiders who are often defined in ethnic terms. That is very common across the region. The last thing I say about the EU, is it behaving like a superpower? I agree, absolutely, that around the year 2000, early 2000s, but really beginning in the early 90s, the EU felt very self-confident, right? It was after the Single European Act, the success of the, 1992 and completing the internal market, and there was a kind of hubris about foreign policy. And the greatest victim of that was Yugoslavia. That hubris helped prolong the war in Bosnia and Croatia and led arguably to the genocide in Srebrenica. But today, I am still very if you're talking about political outcomes today in a particular country, right? Like why was Orbán reelected or Peace reelected in Poland? I think it's the EU's role in that is a very complicated, and I feel very there's many, many things going on, and it's just too easy to say, if the EU had acted differently, these regimes would be different.
Thank you. So we're getting towards the end of our session here, and I want to maybe conclude and get everyone to kind of weigh in on if you think there's a future for democracy in the region, given everything that we've talked about in the last hour and 10 minutes or so. So Zsolt, I wonder if you could start and give us your thoughts on that.
Well, actually, my answer is not so much region-specific, but more global, so to say. I subscribe to the view that some of the engines, some of the impetus behind this big populist wave is the threat that a minority feels, that is actors who feel that they are increasingly in minority, and this is a kind of last stand. So both in East and in the West, there is general fear of global trends that push towards globalization, multiculturalism, secularization, and so on. And this fear of this process is actually well-founded. That is, indeed, if you look at the fundamental attitudes, if you look at the differences between cohorts, how young generations think about the world, how they think about traditional family, how they think about nation states, and so on, that indeed the authoritarian agenda is on the losing side. And this is what they feel, and this is where they have some of their extra energy to organize so efficiently and to mobilize. So in that sense, I'm absolutely optimistic. I think that the trends are very much in favor of a more liberal world than the one that we live in now. But it's also true that the changes do not happen in such a kind of a uniform way across the globe as we expected back then. And agency makes a big difference. So I was looking today at the Politico's European edition, and they came up with a number of names who had the biggest impact on Europe in the last year. And they have a category that they call dreamers. And the number one person is Greta Thunberg, the environment activist. But the number two is Viktor Orban. So I think that's a pretty good. So these two orientations are there, and I think that Greta is the first and Viktor is the second.
Well, I think that's polarization right there. Anna, you want to give your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I too am a cautious optimist, much like Zsolt. I think, and again, I think there's considerable country variation here, right? So, Slovakia, which was the basket case of the 1990s, experienced sort of, again, a slight, backsliding with Smer and with Fico, only to recently elect Zuzana Čaputová, as its president, an anti-corruption, totally liberal democratic, a committed Democrat candidate. So I think, so long as civil society and the opposition parties are preserved, there's always hope, which is why I think I worry more about Hungary than I do about some of the other cases, not just because the opposition is so fragmented, but also because the playing field is no longer level. The sort of constitutional changes of 2010, 2011 have made sure of that. So I remain much more optimistic about Poland, about Czechia, about Slovakia, about all of those cases than I do about Hungary, where the institutional changes have gone so far that it's, it'd be very difficult it's incredibly challenging to organize in the face of those transformations.
Thank you. Isa.
I too believe there is a future, and I think the question is when and what are the costs, and not to say that backsliding doesn't have a future. I think history is very much cyclical, although moving in the what I believe to be the Hegelian right direction. And I think what I find fascinating with the Hungarian case is that, and then building onto Anna's the point that Anna just made, is that it seems that the failure of party politics have pushed people on the streets, which seems to suggest that might be a political opportunity that might help the oppositions to become more coordinated in Hungary. So that's my my thought on where the opportunities might lie. So.
Great, thank you. Milada, your thoughts on the future?
So I love the Greta versus Orban, and I love it especially because I think part of the story here is also big money, right? And we see this, you know, in Hungary and Poland, these are Czech Republic, these are small countries, but even there, the Czech Republic, you see the Agrofert, which is owned by Andrej Babiš, has, you know, controls a huge portion of the Czech Republic's energy and chemical production, and the UK and the US goes without saying, right? And so big money, I think, there's big money that is threatened by climate change adaptation, right? That doesn't want governments to change their policies to counter climate change. I don't know how these people sleep at night, but they don't want it. And they've been incredibly effective in the United States and in the UK of channeling that money and getting people elected who are basically in the pocket of the petrochemical industry. So I think climate change and the young people's kind of mobilization around that, I think that is going to be incredibly important. I also am very hopeful, again, not so hopeful for Hungary, although I will say none of us thought that 1989 would happen, so maybe there would be some kind of an incredible mobilization that we wouldn't expect. I think the protests in the streets are really uplifting. I think they're really hopeful. I think it gets people to participate in politics again. What worries me is when the protests are disconnected from political parties, because like Anna and Zsolt, I think political parties are incredibly important. And, you know, you can't, like the Czech protesters won't let any political parties take part. They're not channeling people to vote for any particular party. And that, I think, can kind of diffuse the power. So I'm afraid that political parties are who get selected and govern, and so these opposition protesters need to face the facts and run for office. I think the European Parliament elections showed us, right, that while there was a increase in votes on the extreme right and the extreme left, also that were anti-European integration, and on the extreme right, anti-cosmopolitan, et cetera. There was also a surge of voting in the center for progressive parties. And so, you know, are we going to have a more polarized situation? I really hope we don't end up like in Hungary, right? That is, I think, the hallmark of a political system also that's going to have a really hard time recovering, because it's this kind of civilizational opposition between two poles, which has really not a lot of content and allows politicians to run, you know, these campaigns on things which are really just about identity and ethnic baiting. But overall, I'm hopeful. I think everyone should go into politics. I think everyone should join parties and get involved.
Well, as a party scholar, I agree. But I realize
this isn't self-serving or anything.
So, well, I want to thank you all, and I'm glad that we've ended on a cautiously optimistic note for everywhere, perhaps except Hungary. And obviously, there's a lot more that we could have discussed, but we are out of time. I'd encourage all of those joining us, if you're interested in this topic, to read what all of our panelists have written. Many of them are very active on social media as well, as this conversation continues both academically and in the public sphere as well. And thank you to all of our audiences today for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.